Today, I want to show you what my settings are when I use the Olympus Em1 Mark I for astrophotography. So the techniques that I'm going to show you today, these are techniques that are very much for doing deep sky astrophotography or like wide field astrophotography, in which we take lots of pictures and we stack them together. And one of the caveats here is the settings that I'm going to show you, okay, they're going to help you optimize the raw files that you make so that when you do calibration frames, you'll be able to better subtract noise. And the reason why we do calibration frames as astrophotographers is because we have much better techniques for removing noise than the camera manufacturers do. Because typically what they do is they do a complete blanket noise reduction on top after the image has been completely assembled. And what that kind of does is just smears the information a little bit. Whereas what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the components of noise. We're going to subtract them at each one's source by doing these different types of calibration frames. And the settings that I will show you, they'll allow you to take these calibration frames and the camera won't mess with your frames, so to speak. First things first, you'd want the mode dial set to the M mode, because we're basically going to do everything manually. And typically I have an intervalometer mounted in the shoe and plugged into the side of the camera, and that's how I take the longer exposures that I do. But I'll show you a couple of tricks here. There's some things that you can do to use the built-in intervalometer in the camera itself. But for picture mode, I use the natural setting. I don't try to oversaturate the image or anything like that. Just basically have it come off the sensor as native as possible. Obviously we shoot raw. Aspect ratio is 4/3, and then down here this is a pretty cool feature. This is an Olympus only kind of feature. They have this intervalometer, which you can basically tell it to take a certain number of frames, have a certain amount of time in between each, and unfortunately this feature limits you to a 60-second exposure, but for a lot of your purposes and uses this may actually be adequate. So let's go back out of that. And then down here in the next area, obviously all these bracketing, multi-exposure, keystone comp, all this stuff is to be turned off. And I typically use, I don't really use any anti-shock settings or anything like that, just because I'm usually using an intervalometer. I'm not touching the camera anyways. It's just doing its own thing. Now, if I did have a really rickety setup, I might actually be tempted to maybe use anti-shock, which would kind of open the shutter temporarily. Like you could do like a 1/8 or 1/4 or even a ½ second, open the shutter first, and then the sensor would start taking an exposure. But that's an option you have at your disposal. High-res shot. I've actually seen the high-res shot used by another guy out there called Chasing Luminance. He's got a really good channel, by the way, and he does a lot of Olympus stuff. But anyways, this will actually kind of take a bunch of pictures and stack them together, which kind of gives you some interesting good results. However, I prefer to use calibration frames. I found that it reduces noise by a much more significant amount. Video features, we aren't really going to touch those. And then we're going to go down here and we're going to start going to the deep settings that are in the Em1 Mark II. There are a ton of settings here at our disposal. So in this area, we're going to be using manual focus. So most of these settings don't really matter. The area pointer doesn't really matter. Obviously the autofocus illuminator, you're going to want to turn that off. You don't want that thing turning on at night. Preset manual focus distance. So you can actually program this to be a specific distance. All this is when the camera turns on, if you have a lens attached, it's just going to automatically set the lens to infinity, which is typically what I have it set to. I have it set to the farthest distance setting and set to infinity. That way we're kind of close to infinity. Now, what the camera thinks is infinity is not usually ever true infinity. You usually got to find that by doing very slight adjustments to focus, because as temperatures change, the point of infinity will actually change, because your lens will shrink or swell based on that. Manual focus assist. I've never really tried using peaking. Some people like it, some people don't. That's just something you want to experiment with yourself. But you definitely do want Magnify. I typically manually magnify, but you can set it up so that when you're turning the dial on the lens, it will actually like automatically magnify for you. I find that kind of a little bit annoying, so I typically leave it off. And I just manually actually go to the settings and turn on magnify. Main focus clutch is operative, of course. Focusing ring, of course, I turn it that way. Bulb time focusing should be on. Reset lens should be on. Oh, let's go down here a few more. A lot of these are custom functions right here, which don't really have anything to do with what we're doing. Now, image stabilization, okay, you definitely want to turn image stabilization off. Okay, I've seen some people advocate for having it on. I definitely think you should turn it off because the sensor could wander around a little bit. Maybe if there's a dirty signal coming into the camera from maybe your battery's getting low, it might start kind of jittering around a little bit. Picture mode settings, obviously, we've already set the picture mode settings, and none of these really matter either. Live view boost. Now this kind of does matter a little bit. It doesn't going to affect the image at all, but it may help you focusing the camera, and this is something you're just going to have to experiment with yourself. I typically leave it on one. Same thing with bulb. Now live composite, I turn that off, of course. And then frame rate increase is normal. None of these settings I really use. USB mode, that's just when you plug the camera into your computer. If you were to control it, auto means it's going to bring up a menu option and allow you to choose the camera. Now the EV step, typically I use either full stops or half stops. Way back in the day I used to use third stops, but that was when sensors were more sensitive to changes and they didn't have as much dynamic range as they do now. The EV step, the default thinking in the astrophotography community is that you should use one EV step settings for your ISOs. In other words, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, so forth. And that's because sometimes these cameras have a built-in dual gain system, and using those in-between ISOs can sometimes jump one of those, and that wouldn't be good because it might increase noise a little bit. Now, some testing that I've seen though has shown that the Em1 Mkii and the Em1 Mkii actually performs really well at ISO 2000. So, you know, there's some merit to experimenting with that, you know, but by default, I pretty much use EV1, and that's because the two ISOs that I typically use is either ISO 1600 or ISO 200. And then, of course, auto select, that's typically, we're not using auto select. We're selecting the ISO ourselves. Now, noise filter is definitely to be turned off, okay, and then noise reduction I also turn off. And noise reduction is going to take a dark frame in between each and every single picture. And the problem with having this on is that it's basically going to double the amount of time it's going to take you to get a picture of something. And you wouldn't want that, because we're going to take separate dark frames and stack them together and make a master dark frame, which is much better than taking just one dark frame. Alright, bulb timer, 2 minutes. That's just if I was to use the bulb timer. And then metering doesn't really matter much. Exposure shift doesn't matter. None of the flash stuff really matters. Now the file, of course, obviously I'm using raw files, so yeah, that really doesn't matter. Shading composition, you definitely want this off. So shading composition is kind of like Olympus has done flats at the factory, and for each lens, when it hooks up to that lens, it knows kind of what the vignetting is for that particular lens. However, if you're hooking up to a telescope, you know, or even if you are hooking up to an Olympus lens, you probably should do your own flats, because you will be able to fine-tune that shading composition or compensation to a much higher degree than they did at the factory, because they're doing kind of a blanket, this kind of works good for everybody, whereas if you do your own flats, you're getting a custom flat exactly for that lens, because there is manufacturing variances from lens to lens that could cause it to be a little bit different. So I turn shading composition off. For white balance, okay, I typically use daytime sunny, okay, because that's typically that that particular curve, I should say, to the sensitivity curve of the camera, it matches the optimum curve to the sensor itself, because that's kind of how most sensors are designed. That's really just a sensor design thing. Some people will say that raw files, that doesn't really matter. However, you got to keep in mind that when you're stacking software, it turns a file either TIFFs or FITS files, and it may not be able to interpolate that information correctly. So I use Sunny. Warm filter, I turn that off, and then the color space, I also use Adobe RGB. And once again, I've had a lot of people say, this doesn't matter because it's a raw file, but keep in mind that when you're stacking, almost all stacking software out there will convert the file into either a TIFF or a FITS file, and that information will be lost. So card slot settings don't really matter much. You can shoot RAW plus JPEG. Typically I shoot just RAW. And a lot of times I do fill cards up. So EVF, auto switch, you can turn off the internal EVF altogether, and you may want to do that actually to kind of conserve battery space. That is my tutorial on how to set up your Em1 Mark II for astrophotography, specifically if you're using calibration frames. Hope you found this video helpful. I know when I first started doing this about 3 or 4 years ago with the new mirrorless cameras, there was basically nothing out there for astrophotography with Olympus gear, and been trying to kind of fill that void. So I hope you enjoyed that, and maybe subscribe, hit the like button. Have a great day, and hope you get some clear skies.